In my last video, I went through my personal top 10 hardest platinums I've earned since I started trophy hunting all the way back in 2009. And I want to start this video off by giving a massive thank you to everybody who tuned into that first video, especially those who made suggestions on the type of content you'd like to see from the channel. I'm always interested in getting suggestions directly from you, and I have a lot of ideas for the channel and plan to accelerate my efforts in the coming months. So please make sure you like and subscribe to see what I've got planned coming up soon. At the end of that first video, I mentioned that I was going to start going for some really hard platinums. And so using the games that I rattled off at the end of that list as a starting point, I added quite a few more that I think fit the definition of hard. And I generated a complete list of games that I plan to attack in a new series focusing on hard platinums. Many games on this list have at least one trophy that's known for its exceptional difficulty, and some of them are just hard games overall and come with multiple difficult trophies. Most of these are going to be 7 or 8 out of 10s with some 6s peppered in, but also some 9s and 10s. If there's a game I've missed, feel free to add it in the comments. Instead of creating a separate video for every single game and going through every single trophy individually, I thought I'd start off with a more compact and concise approach of completing a handful of games and giving each one a short review. With each game, I'll go over a few basic things. I'll give a basic rundown of the story, which will contain some spoilers, but don't worry, I'll have spoiler tags beforehand. Next, I'll go through difficulty and time required for platinum, specific trophies to be aware of, and how much you'll need to rely on a guide. Additionally, I'll decide whether the game would go in my top 10 hardest platinums now if I were to make a new list. For completionists, I'll also rate how the game's platinum trophy compares to a true 100% in the game, if such a thing can be determined. Lastly, I'll end with an overall summary of the platinum experience. It's there where I'll talk about how enjoyable or rewarding the platinum trophy is. Should you go for the platinum? Should you just play the game and forget about the trophies, or should you just skip the game altogether? My goal with this series is to provide some basic information about the game, describe my experience, provide key details on what the platinum trophy journey entails, so that other gamers or trophy hunters can decide whether or not this game is worth their time. I intend to start with some of the games on the lower tiers of difficulty and progress towards some of the harder ones, some of those 9s and 10s. As I get to more of the most difficult games, the number of games I cover in each video may go down simply because the amount of time I'll be spending on each game is going to probably increase. For most of these games, I'll also be completing the DLC trophies for each game, but I most likely won't be covering that in the video. Now let's lay some ground rules for this hard platinum series. I do not intend to beat all of these games in the hardest way possible, but I also won't be paying for platinums, hacking trophies, or anything like that. In general, these are some of the restrictions I'll be placing on myself. No share play, hacks, or downloading a save file off the internet. No save scumming to save a no death or no fail run like I did in Arkham Origins. We're going to come back to save scumming in a minute. No God mode invincibility exploits like I used in Black Ops 3. No purchasing DLC content just to make a trophy easier, unless there are trophies associated with that DLC. We're also going to get an example of that as well. I'm also going to utilize every bit of willpower I have to try and avoid cheesing any bosses or using any unfair exploits. Essentially, I don't want it to feel undeserved when I finish. What I will allow for myself is playing on easier difficulties when allowed, looking up tips online including step-by-step walkthroughs of difficult parts, optimal paths, speedrun strategies, or any other reliance on another player or guide. This is all a part of the global dissemination of strategies that has been around since at least the dawn of the internet. Use of DLC items that make part of the platinum easier if the DLC has trophies tied to it. Co-op or summons. Overpowered weapons, skills, abilities, builds, strategies, etc., etc. If it's in the game, it's fair game. Save scumming to avoid additional playthroughs. Since this is just a matter of saving time and not an attempt to avoid a difficult challenge, it allows me to get through the platinum quicker without reducing the skill-based requirements needed to get the platinum. The ultimate goal with the games in this series is to get the platinum trophy. This channel isn't necessarily about doing the hardest things to ever exist in gaming. Some of these games will of course be very hard, as I'm making that a theme of this series, but I will not intentionally handicap myself more than necessary to make a platinum harder than it needs to be. If a From Software game allows me to summon NPCs or friends as a legitimate game mechanic, I'm usually going to take advantage. I may add in an additional challenge here or there just to spice things up, but in general, the goal here is to get the platinum without quote-unquote cheating. Not to beat the hardest possible version of every game, and I'll do my best to avoid any exploits that make the platinum feel undeserved, but again, I'm not going to handicap myself more than necessary. So with that introduction out of the way, let's get into the first 3 games in this brand new series on hard platinums. I decided to start with 3 specific games: Vanquish, Cuphead, and Sekiro. These platinum difficulties are rated at 9 out of 10, 7 out of 10, and 7 out of 10 respectively. These are somewhat older games that I've always wanted to play for many years, so I figured this would be a great way to kick off this new series. Vanquish is a game I'd always heard about but never tried. It always seemed to be one of those underappreciated PS3 gems that not a lot of people talk about, but the people who have played it usually have good things to say about it. It's a fast-paced, high-intensity, third-person shooter from developers Platinum Games, who also developed the Bayonetta series and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Now, I've not played either of those franchises, but 10 minutes into Vanquish, combined with a crude familiarity of their other work, tells you exactly the type of gameplay that this team loves creating. Bullets are constantly flying all around you, and you're expected to move quickly from cover to cover, rotating between multiple combat mechanics in order to take out a swarm of hyper-aggressive enemies. This game feels like a third-person shooter bullet hell, which is a combination I don't think I've ever quite experienced in a game. If I had to describe Vanquish in one word, it would be cool. This game is the epitome of the "be the American the Japanese think you are" meme.
Nanomachine, son.
You play as Sam Gideon, a cool, handsome, quippy, chain-smoking badass. Your partner for much of the game is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Burns, a brutish, scarred Marine equipped with a shielded minigun. Burns looks like something straight out of Gears of War or Doom, covered in muscles and scars. The story of Vanquish is a familiar one. An evil Russian megalomaniac, Viktor Zaitsev, wants to destroy the United States and put Russia back at the top of the global power hierarchy. Viktor is equipped with a high-tech Iron Man-type suit of armor, and you're the only person who could put a stop to it. The game is littered with cliches commonly found in the PS3 era hyper-masculine shooters, 80s action flicks, and good guy, bad guy narratives. Vanquish adds some incredible style and action to the familiar storyline with high-intensity gunfights using futuristic high-tech weapons, armor, and abilities. The story leaves you with a cliffhanger and ends rather abruptly, as if a sequel for Vanquish was planned from the start. Unfortunately for all lovers of third-person shooters, there's no evidence at this time that we will be seeing a sequel to Vanquish anytime soon. Vanquish is a game built around its fast-paced combat, and in order to complete the game on hard, you'll have to become familiar with the game's movement, weapons, and enemies. The game is really short. My initial playthrough on hard took just slightly over 4 hours. Hard difficulty is not particularly challenging. Weapons can be upgraded quickly and up to 10 times each by picking up another copy of the weapon while you have full ammo. This will increase the weapon's damage and clip size. A few encounters or bosses may take some practice, but there's nothing really here in the main story that would be a platinum stopper for most people. The tactical challenges are a completely different story and will be what stands between most people and the platinum trophy. The single player trophies in Vanquish can all be earned in 6 to 8 hours, but the tactical challenges will be highly skill dependent. They could take you 2 hours or 20 or more. You should expect to spend at least 15 hours on this platinum. According to my PS5, I have 35 hours played in Vanquish, but I think that's either way off or I must have left the game on for an extended period of time, because I'm pretty sure it only took about 20 hours. The bulk of the trophy list in Vanquish will be earned once you beat the game on hard without dying, complete some easy miscellaneous tasks and certain missions, grab some collectibles, and complete 6 tactical challenges. Beating the game on hard without dying might have been a challenge in other circumstances, but in Vanquish, by quitting to the main menu anytime you die instead of utilizing a restart checkpoint, the game doesn't actually register the death. So this made the trophy significantly easier, but truthfully the main story of Vanquish is not very difficult, and I think that this could be done with some practice, especially considering the level of skill you'll need to develop just to complete the tactical challenges. 5 of these challenges are unlocked as you complete the 5 acts of the main story, and the 6th challenge is unlocked after beating the first 5 challenges. Each challenge consists of 5 waves of enemies and is a significant spike in difficulty from anything you're going to experience in the main story. Right from the very first challenge, I was humbled and surprised at how much harder it is compared to the main story. Challenges 4 and 6 are particularly difficult, requiring true mastery of the game's shooting, sliding, cover, and AR mechanics. Challenge 4 took me at least a day, and I think Challenge 6 took me 2 or 3 days. I believe that much of the difficulty in these challenges comes from the fact that the campaign is very short, and it doesn't really test you in any truly difficult sequences. The main story doesn't require you to build this level of skill to beat it on hard, and considering it's only 4 hours long, you just don't get a ton of practice playing the game before you begin the challenges. Some of these challenges provide very little cover, so you have to be sliding and rolling non-stop from point A to point B just to avoid enemy fire. Each round a bunch of enemies will spawn and they are immediately on your ass. Most enemies will flank you if you sit still for too long. There are also many enemies that can kill you very quickly. Some attacks can take you out in one hit. Beating these challenges requires you to familiarize yourself with enemy spawn points in each specific round of each challenge. You'll need to know where the enemies spawn, what type, and how many. You'll need to know what weapons work best on each enemy type, because you'll need to kill some of them very quickly or you'll get overwhelmed in seconds. The most important key in beating these challenges is in effectively managing your AR meter. AR, or Augmented Reaction, allows you to boost dash at super speed or to slow time for precision aiming. AR mode gives an automatic time slowdown when you're close to death, but only if your AR meter is not depleted. If your AR meter is empty, or worse, overheated, your only hope is to roll, and pray you don't get killed while it recharges. You have to be constantly moving, popping in and out of AR mode, killing enemies quickly, and avoiding enemy gunfire that's peppering the screen. Some of the harder challenges felt a little bit like Max Payne 3's New York Minute Hardcore mode. Similar to these challenges, that mode requires precise knowledge of enemy spawn points, their weaknesses, pinpoint accuracy to get headshots and kill enemies quickly, and also quick movement from cover to cover. You're constantly popping in and out of a mechanic that slows time, allowing for easier headshots, but also opening you up to depleting your meter. In both games, the closer your meter is to empty, the greater risk you run of dying quickly. If your meter goes completely empty, you no longer have a way to survive death. Vanquish takes all of that and cranks the intensity up to 100. You're not just going from normal speed to slow-mo and back, like in Max Payne 3. You're often going from high-speed boost into slow-mo and constantly rotating between fast, normal, and slow speeds. You have enemies all over you at all times, and you're usually just inches away from death. In some cases, it feels like just pure luck when you manage to scrape by and make it to the nearest cover. You'll want to review a trophy guide at some point for optimizing weapon upgrades, and some of the collectibles are in some very unpredictable locations. so they could be tricky to find without a guide. The miscellaneous story trophies could realistically be earned just through playing the game normally, but a guide will tell you the best missions to obtain a few of the trickier ones. Vanquish has no missable trophies, and the miscellaneous ones can be earned through chapter select. The tactical challenges will be very tough for most players, and you'll most likely need to look up tips and strategies on how to beat a few of them. For Tactical Challenge 6, I watched multiple videos of other players beating it and read many tips online, and it still took me a long time to beat them, even when trying to replicate those strategies as best as I could. You can find some incredibly skilled players online that are just absolutely crushing these challenges in a couple minutes, but that's going to require many hours of practice with the game, as well as a complete understanding of all exploitable game mechanics, such as boost dodging, animation cancels, and so on. I have to say this was a lot harder than I expected it to be, and I think it's certainly deserving of the 9 out of 10 difficulty rating. I can say with confidence that absolutely this game would be now in my top 10 hardest platinums. Where exactly, I'm not sure, but it's closer to the top of the list than the bottom. This was truly a difficult platinum. But like the rest, if you spend enough time practicing, gathering tips, and refining your strategy, all things are possible. And that's going to be an overarching theme of the channel. See, I'm not particularly skilled or talented at video games. I don't have cat-like reflexes. My brain doesn't work any faster or harder than the average person's, but I'm persistent. I'll struggle over and over with a game, but I'll keep trying until I get through it, because I truly believe it's just a matter of practice, strategy refinement, optimization, and muscle memory. So, how close is the Platinum Trophy to true 100% completion? The only bit of Vanquish that you won't experience while going for the Platinum is completing the game on God Hard difficulty, which is earned after beating the game the first time. God Hard sounds like an absolute nightmare, and not something I'm keen on attempting anytime soon, since there's no trophy tied to it. Enemies are tougher, you're weaker, and you get no weapon upgrades. It sounds absolutely masochistic, and if you have somehow managed to complete this, then I applaud you, especially since there's no virtual bling in the form of trophies rewarding you for your struggle. If you can manage to beat God Hard along with earning the Platinum, then you will have experienced everything and completed everything that Vanquish has to offer. Vanquish has cool visuals and fast-paced gunplay that make combat encounters exhilarating and exciting. The back-and-forth dialogue between you and Burns is campy and predictable, but still entertaining, like a cheesy 80s action flick. The story is nothing exceptional, but the game is very fun to play. I recommend you go for the Platinum only if you care about going for hard Platinums. Like all challenges, you'll feel rewarded when it's finally completed, but only if you're into that kind of thing. If you don't enjoy the challenge, just play through the game's story on an easier difficulty for the experience. Cuphead is another game that I've been meaning to play for a long time now. I actually have Cuphead in my car, and I've played it a few times, but never really gave the console version a try because I knew the Platinum would require some commitment, and I didn't really want to start it until I was ready to commit to it all the way through. So it just sat on my games to play list for quite a few years. Since it released back in 2017, we've always heard about how hard of a game Cuphead is. 2017 actually saw quite a few hard games released. We got Cuphead, Hollow Knight, Wolfenstein 2, Neo, the Crash Bandicoot trilogy, to name a few. These are still some of the hardest Platinum trophies you can get, and from everything I had heard, Cuphead was also just an overall great game, so I was definitely excited to finally commit to this one. Cuphead is a rather sinister story about two beverage receptacles who made a literal deal with the devil for their souls while playing craps in the devil's casino. Yes, don't let the Tex Avery Cartoon Network style fool you. There is a rather dark story at play here. You wagered your souls in a game of craps and lost, and now the devil tells you that in order to keep your soul, you have to claim the souls of the devil's other debtors, who are basically bosses that owe their souls to the devil. You defeat the boss, you get its soul. The game is essentially a boss rush. Much of the game is spent on boss fights. The moment-to-moment gameplay is spent trying to chip away at a large health pool of the boss, who usually goes through multiple phases while trying to avoid a multitude of harmful projectiles peppering the screen. When you get through all the bosses, you can end the game in one of two ways. You can either keep your end of the bargain, give the devil the soul contracts, and make Cuphead and Mugman his instruments of evil, or you can defeat him. Upon defeating the devil, the bosses that you previously beat are freed from the devil's debt, and they cheer the player in a celebration throughout Inkwell Isle. Cuphead was always considered a pretty hard game ever since it came out. There's a lot of things on the screen that you have to avoid throughout the boss fights, and the margin of error while jumping between and around projectiles is pretty tight. Your jumps need to be precise, and aiming your weapon at the boss is sometimes a secondary priority behind just avoiding damage and staying alive. The game eventually saw a significant difficulty reduction with a future DLC release, The Delicious Last Course, that added some new weapons and a new playable character, Miss Chalice. Miss Chalice gives you the ability to double jump without parrying, which is a huge advantage, and the parry mechanic turns into a dash instead of a double jump. Additionally, one of the new weapons, called Crackshot, has a homing feature so you don't even have to aim. Both of these additions made the base game significantly easier than what I would have expected otherwise, but since there were actually trophies tied to these items and this character, I didn't feel too guilty about using them for my whole playthrough, but it certainly takes the difficulty of this platinum from like a 7 or a 8 to probably a 5 or a 6 in my opinion. So what do we think? Is this cheating, using the DLC items? I personally don't think so, but I do recognize that this platinum is not as impressive as it would have been without the DLC, so as it would have been at release date. But truthfully, there's a lot of games that get additional content after release, or they get updated in such a way that the platinum becomes significantly easier. Fall Guys is a good example. They introduced some additional game modes that made Infallible significantly easier. That's getting 5 wins in a row. When that game came out, this trophy was notoriously difficult, but then Fall Guys added some additional game modes that were a lot easier to win. So those 5 wins in a row became a lot easier, and that's how I got the platinum. And it certainly is less impressive, but I won't turn down that opportunity to take advantage of that. Many games introduce DLC that can be used in the base game, which make the platinum either easier, quicker, or more enjoyable. In fact, I just played an older one very recently, Dragon Age Origins. Played through that for the first time. I bought the Ultimate Edition because it came with all the DLC, and I did some of the DLC content early because it grants you access to some pretty good items, and it just makes the game not only easier but more enjoyable. And so, I rarely buy games at release. Some games and some platinums get easier with updates, others get harder. But I play a game when I play it, and I will typically use whatever the game gives me at that time. And especially since the Cuphead DLC has trophies tied to it, I think this is a case where I'm okay taking advantage and not feeling like I cheated myself. I would not have purchased these items just to make the game easier if there weren't trophies tied to them. So utilizing the DLC items, some bosses may still require some practice. There's certainly a few that had me attempting many times before I finally beat them, but the boss fights are quick. They only take a few minutes, and memorizing enemy attack patterns and attacking when you have the opportunity is the solution to the hardest parts about this game. There's nothing that puts this on the level of Vanquish, even without the DLC items. I imagine this will be one of the easier games I experience in this series. Even with the DLC items, you can still expect to spend probably 15 to 20 hours on this platinum. Part of that is because you have to beat the game twice, but again, this is highly skill dependent and depends on your level of skill, not just with platforming, but also bullet hell type games that require constant damage avoidance. Trophy guides are going to clock this one in at around 30 hours, but I managed to do base game and DLC in about 19 hours. That, of course, was using the DLC items. As I mentioned, you'll have to beat this game twice, the second time being on Expert. The bulk of the game is boss fights, each lasting 2 to 3 minutes. You'll likely be replaying each boss multiple times to get A ranks on all of them and an S rank on at least one. There's 40 coins to collect throughout the run and gun levels, so these are levels that don't have a boss in them, but they're kind of just side scroller levels that you just make it to the end and you complete the level. But there's some coins in these levels that need to be collected, and you'll also need to complete each of these run and gun levels without killing any enemies for the pacifist trophy, which can be a little tricky. After that, the remaining miscellaneous trophies should be pretty easy to clean up. Cuphead is a game where it is entirely possible to get the platinum just by playing the game and without utilizing a guide. Most of the bosses have just a set few number of attacks that they rotate between, and through practice you can learn their attack patterns and know when and where to jump to avoid damage. Completing all the run and gun levels without killing an enemy might be pretty tricky without some outside help, since some of those require very specific strategies to clear safely. Thankfully, there's nothing in the Cuphead Platinum that requires a thorough study of a guide, and there's no missable trophies. With the DLC items, this Platinum is fairly simple. I couldn't replace any game in my current top 10 hardest with this one. Without the DLC, I could maybe see this game being at the very bottom of the list at number 10, but not much higher than that, and truthfully, I don't even think I could put it at number 10. The truth is, Cuphead is about dodging and parrying, and it's not nearly as demanding in that regard as the next game I'm about to talk about. Playing this game as it was at release will certainly take you longer, and some bosses will take more attempts for sure, but I wouldn't expect it to be on the same level of difficulty as some of these other games. But hey, maybe I'm wrong and it's brutal, and maybe someday I'll go back and play Cuphead as it was at release, since it is a rather short game, so it's not a huge time commitment to get through. The only thing you really won't do in Cuphead while going for the Platinum is getting an S rank on all levels, and I imagine this would be really challenging since getting S rank on even one level wasn't exactly easy. The game does track your total completion percentage, and getting an S rank in all levels is not required to reach 100% as defined by the developers with that tracker. And so using the developer's definition of 100% seems reasonable to me. And so just by simply collecting all the coins, completing all the levels, and defeating all the bosses on Expert, you'll reach 100% according to the in-game tracker. However, I think we all have our own ideas of what true 100% looks like, so I like to mention the additional things a person might consider when looking at a game from a completionist perspective. Cuphead has a great art style, fun run and gun gameplay, and no unnecessary filler content. Nothing in Cuphead feels like wasted time. Each boss fight feels fun, challenging, and unique. On the bad side, actually I don't have anything bad to say about Cuphead. It's a great indie title and well worth $20. I would definitely recommend this game to anybody regardless of the trophies. If you're interested in trying some hard games, Cuphead might be a good one to start off with. While it has certainly been eclipsed in the coming years by some rather infamously difficult titles, Cuphead remains a fantastic game with an appropriate level of difficulty. It's difficult, but it's fair. There's a formula for beating each boss, and it just requires patience and practice. With no especially grindy or missable trophies, this Platinum experience is the perfect mix of fun and challenge. I've heard many people call Sekiro both the best From Software game and also the hardest From Software game. Regardless of personal opinions on quality and difficulty, there's no denying that Sekiro is an incredible game with some of the finest combat ever put to pixels. For that reason, I made a conscious effort to take my time with this game on the first playthrough, especially. I wanted to get this video out by the end of the year, so I gave myself exactly 2 weeks to get this Platinum from scratch. It felt daunting at first based on what I'd heard about the game's difficulty, but it was just enough time for me to play the game exactly how I would prefer to play it my first time through, at my own pace, exploring the things that I wanted to explore and not rushing through it. Now, considering this is a From Software game, I'm not going to try and explain the story in any great depth. This is not going to be the go-to place for secrets or lore for the worlds that From Software has built, There's plenty of resources online, including many YouTube channels that go into the lore behind these games in great depth. While not as convoluted and intellectually demanding as a game like Elden Ring to figure out, there are still some things in Sekiro's story that can be confusing, especially on a first playthrough. The game starts off with your character's Japanese village being invaded while you're a small child. A large, towering figure stands over you as your village burns around you. This figure ends up adopting you as his son and molding you into a great shinobi with the sole purpose of protecting your lord, Kiryu. As the game progresses, your ultimate goal largely remains the same, and that's to protect Lord Kiryu. Now, as you play through the game, there are some fantastical themes that arise around immortality, bloodlines, and dragons. Typical From Software type shit. I won't go too in-depth on it, but the game presents you a variety of ways to finish out the game. Depending on which conversations you have, areas you visit, bosses you defeat, choices you make, you can end up getting one of 4 possible endings. All 4 endings are required for the platinum, but you can easily use a backup save to eliminate the need for 4 full playthroughs. Some of these choice paths involve unique bosses that cannot be discovered unless you're taking very specific actions, having very specific conversations at the right time. In this way, From Software does a masterful job at presenting players with a variety of ways to play the game. While not typically considered an RPG like a lot of their other titles, Sekiro still retains a lot of freedom of choice to warrant multiple playthroughs, whether it's for trophies or just personal enjoyment of the game. I didn't do 4 full playthroughs just due to the immense time requirement, but I could easily see myself enjoying this game for another full playthrough, even without any trophies being involved. If you've never played a From Software game before, you'll probably find Sekiro to be very challenging. And even if you are a Souls vet, you'll still probably struggle early on because the combat is quite a bit different, so there's still some brain retraining that must occur to be successful. I think the hardest From Software game for most people is the first one they play. If you've played any of them, you have a general sense of their difficulty, and you should be able to get through Sekiro's Platinum if you have beaten any of the other From Software games. Sekiro shares a lot of similarities with other From Software titles. For starters, there's definitely a learning curve when you first start playing the game. Bosses and even simple early game encounters feel unfairly difficult in the beginning, and that's intentional. But when you become familiar with the combat system, the enemy types, boss attack patterns, it gets easier. The big difference between Sekiro and games like Elden Ring or Dark Souls is that Sekiro emphasizes parrying. Dodging does give a small amount of invincibility frames, but the window's very tight compared to a game like Elden Ring. The bosses and gameplay in Sekiro are built around parrying. Parrying is harder to pull off than blocking naturally, but a perfect parry results in a big hit to the enemy's poise, which will allow you to take down the boss faster. In that regard, Sekiro is a rhythm-based combat game. There's also no summon mechanic in Sekiro, so you're on your own for the most part. The silver lining is that Sekiro does provide a lot of opportunities to take down enemies and even entire areas using stealth, so you can get through a good chunk of the game without going face to face with those tough low to mid-level bad guys. One very useful skill in Sekiro is the Makiri counter. This is a special counter attack designed to deal with thrust attacks, which are usually unblockable. A Makiri counter can be performed by pressing circle as the red symbol pops up, or as an enemy thrusts towards you. I struggled heavily in being able to consistently perform this, so I ended up not really using it for much of my playtime. It wasn't until halfway through New Game Plus when I realized the key to using the counter correctly is in not pressing any directional buttons. I kept pressing left or right with circle, and so I was dodging instead of doing a Makiri counter, so it took me way too long to learn that, but once when I did, it became incredibly useful. There are certain bosses that if you can effectively Makiri counter them, they become significantly easier. And so instead of just taking the time to learn how to do it correctly, I just relied on other less reliable defensive strategies instead, which certainly made things more difficult for myself. By simply pressing circle alone or with the forward directional button, the counter is actually very easy to perform and offers a very useful poise damage. This makes a lot of bosses significantly easier, which brings me to my first big tip. Utilize the training dummy at the beginning of the game to learn how to perform the various offensive and defensive maneuvers. The game offers you tools and skills for a reason. In many cases, these tools are crucial for defeating a boss down the line. So learning how to effectively use those tools and skills will be vital for anybody looking to clear this game or to get its platinum. Sekiro incentivizes and promotes exploration and going off the beaten path, like a lot of other From Software titles. If you find yourself stuck at a difficult part, you can often explore in another direction and level up, or find items that'll make it easier to get through the part that you were previously stuck at. In my first 10 hours, I found myself getting absolutely destroyed by Lady Butterfly, who's the second boss of the game. It took me a few hours to realize that I missed an entire large section earlier in the game, including the first boss, that's meant to actually be explored before you ever reach Lady Butterfly. Once I went back and explored more thoroughly some of those earlier areas, I got my attack power, health bar, and prosthetic tool upgraded, and was able to come back and beat Lady Butterfly on my first try. Quick travel between areas allows you to grind out some earlier levels for XP or upgrades, and the homeward idol allows you to teleport to the nearest idol to restore your health or spend your skills before they are accidentally lost from dying. There were some bosses that took me a few hours to beat. Genichiro and Lady Butterfly were early walls that I faced. I eventually got past them after a few upgrades. Later on, bosses like Demon of Hatred, Owl 1, Owl 2, Sword Saint Ishin, and Ishin Ashina were also pretty tough. Sometimes the best strategy for me was simply avoiding damage and attacking in small chunks when it was safe to do so, but this is certainly not the most effective way to deal with most of the bosses in Sekiro. Most bosses can be defeated much quicker if you precisely time the parries of multiple successive attacks, so it definitely rewards a more aggressive playstyle. Enemy attacks sometimes come in rapid succession, and each one has the potential to deal significant damage, so one small misstep can mean death. Some bosses also throw in attacks that can only be avoided in a specific way, so sweep attacks, thrusts, grab attacks, those cannot be blocked, so you either need to jump, Makiri counter, dodge step, or find some other way to avoid the attack. Some bosses clearly telegraph their attacks so they're easier to avoid, while others are better at disguising their intentions. One lesson remains consistent across all bosses, and that is this: hesitation is defeat. You're rewarded more generously for playing aggressively and learning to parry, as opposed to playing it safe and spending a whole fight waiting for an opening. The endgame XP grind is rather tedious. It'll be long and boring if you're still in New Game Plus, but at least it'll be easy. An additional playthrough will make things more enjoyable and will add additional XP for each enemy, but you'll also lose access to some late game grind spots until you reach them again, which would require you to get through many of the main bosses again. That said, by the time you get to New Game Plus, you'll have mastered the combat well enough to where you'll likely be speeding through the game on New Game Plus, including even most bosses. Most players should expect to spend at least 50 hours on this platinum. That's going to be highly skill dependent. The endgame XP grind took me about 4 or 5 hours, but it didn't really require my full attention, so I did it while watching John Wick and half of John Wick 2. Shout out to Keanu Reeves.
Whoa.
From Software games have similar trophy list formats across different titles. It's typically something like defeat all the bosses, obtain all the endings, fully upgrade one or more weapons, acquire all or a certain number of weapons, skills, upgrades, etc., and there's usually a few miscellaneous trophies that aren't too bad. The XP grind is tedious but not difficult, and not as bad as a game like Injustice where you need to AFK your console for like a week straight. In typical From Software fashion, each time you clear the game, you have the option to start a new playthrough, New Game Plus. And so with each new game that you play, your items, skills, upgrades, etc., almost all of it will carry over in Sekiro. So for most of the missable trophies, most of the collectible trophies, whatever you don't get in your initial playthrough, you can typically clean up in your following playthroughs. The 4 different endings are highly missable since they require very specific choices to be made. I actually fumbled 2 of them in my first playthrough by killing the Divine Dragon too soon. Even though I was looking at a guide pretty regularly, I just missed a part of it, and so that extended the number of playthroughs that I had to do for the Platinum. There are also some items related to trophies that will become inaccessible in later parts of the game based on your decisions, and certain upgrade materials can only be obtained through very specific quests or side bosses. This Platinum will likely require heavy use of a guide unless you spent hundreds of hours in Sekiro and have naturally completed all of this highly missable content. Sekiro is a challenging game, but 5 years after release, there's an abundance of tips, strats, skips, and boss cheeses available online. I made a conscious effort to avoid any cheese methods in Sekiro, and I stuck to that. But frankly, no boss really challenged me to the point where I thought a cheese method was necessary. And I actually did cheese a handful of bosses in Elden Ring, but I didn't find Sekiro to be as hard as I thought it was going to be. I did do a little bit of XP grinding early on to earn a few skills, but I didn't have to spend hours and hours leveling up just to get through the game like I did with some of the earlier From Software titles that I played. Even though some of the bosses took me a couple hours to beat, all the other games on my top 10 list from November put me through a lot more stress and anxiety than Sekiro ever did, so I can't put Sekiro above any of those games. Sekiro and all other From Software titles are massive games. Not only do they have large, sprawling, semi-open or fully open worlds, but they're usually littered with tons of side quests, unique items or gear, and a bunch of other little secrets that might be very tough to find unless you spend hours and hours playing the game, or you look through an in-depth guide. Sekiro is much more linear than, say, Elden Ring, but there's still some mini-bosses and maybe a side quest or 2 that could be completely skipped while just going for the Platinum. There's also many items in the game that are completely unnecessary if you're only going for the Platinum, but they add to the game experience in one way or another. Oftentimes these items provide a very specific buff or advantage and allow you to tailor your approach to combat as you wish. Sekiro also has a boss gauntlet mode that came in a post-release update called Gauntlets of Strength, which doesn't have any trophies, but it can award you additional outfits and skills if you manage to complete them. There's a bit more to Sekiro than you would experience if you're only going for the Platinum trophy, so if you're looking for a true 100% where you complete everything and obtain every single item, you should expect to rely on some additional guides. Sekiro is a great game, and I certainly recommend anybody who can handle a bit of a challenge to at least play through it one time. The Platinum Trophy will require some dedication beyond just a single playthrough, as well as adherence to very specific questline choices to obtain all the highly missable items and endings. The one great thing about Sekiro's Platinum is that it requires you to experience a significant portion of the total game experience. Many of these items or bosses you might never actually come across just naturally playing the game. The Platinum forces you to explore a majority of the areas in the game, collect most of the items, and fight all main bosses and a handful of mini-bosses. The Platinum Trophy in Sekiro is not exactly 100% of the game, as previously discussed, but it's closer to 100% than it is for Bloodborne or Elden Ring. The endgame XP grind adds a 5 to 8 hour layer of unnecessary tedium to the Platinum time, which is an unfortunate way to end an otherwise fantastic gaming experience. If you're looking for a game that you can play your own way, the Platinum for Sekiro may not be for you, but don't miss out on some of the most satisfying combat you'll experience in a game, and at least give the game one playthrough. And there you have it. 3 hard platinums down. These games presented a real challenge, and Vanquish had me truly questioning myself at times, and there's no way in hell I'll be going for the PS3 stack. But these were 3 very good games that I would absolutely recommend. Thanks again for joining, and let me know what game you want to see me conquer next. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I plan to keep this series going as long as there are hard platinums to earn.